Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the screening. This is our world premiere of our new documentary, Putin's Endgame, The Stakes Beyond Ukraine. I'm Ashley Semler, one of the executive producers of the film and the senior director of video production at the Atlantic Council. I'm joined here by three people who put a tremendous amount of work into this film, and I'm eager to hear more from them about the process and some of the key things that they learned from making this film. So we have here Kevin Tibbles, who's the correspondent of this film, who you just saw traversing Finland, Estonia, and Sweden. Kevin is an Emmy and Peabody award-winning correspondent from NBC News, and Joel Seidman, the producer of this film, is an Emmy-winning producer, most recently senior producer at NBC Nightly News, and he's the producer and director of this film. And Ambassador John Herbst is a former US ambassador to Ukraine and now the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and also an executive producer of the film. So thank you all for joining us. Ambassador Herbst, let me start with you. What is the reason for making this film, and what is one of the main takeaways you want people to have from watching it?
Ashley, thanks for the question. It's pretty simple. Putin's revanchist foreign policy is designed to greatly weaken the United States, first and foremost by weakening our partners, by destroying Ukraine, and undermining NATO, and for that matter, the EU. And Putin's doing this, as the film points out, in conjunction with Xi and China, and then his little pals, North Korea and Iran. And so we have a vital stake. We, the United States, have a vital stake in ensuring Putin's defeat in Ukraine. And while there are a fair number of people in this town who understand that, there are too many in the outgoing administration and the incoming administration who don't. And this film was designed to bring home this very clear and very important truth.
Thank you. Kevin, what were some of your impressions of talking to people for this film, traveling throughout the region? What were people telling you, and what was the general atmosphere in the region?
Well, I'm hoping that it came out in some of the interviews how, especially interviews with the younger people, how frightened they were. You could tell on their face whenever you dropped the question. These would be young people of military age, of course. What's going to happen? What happens if you are next? And you could see that some of the young fellows we spoke to were actually almost too frightened to answer the question, and they would nod their heads. We found this especially in Estonia. I think Estonia's history shows, a quarter of the people in Estonia today are Russian. In Narva, for example, the language is Russian. And as we mentioned in the doc, when the Soviets took over Estonia, many of the people were deported from their own country and sent to labor camps, and anyone who had complained about their coffee in the future would have been whacked, basically. So I noticed there that there was this underlying fear. In Finland as well, we're all familiar with the phrase Finlandization that took place during the Cold War, where the Finns were sort of forced to have a stance that would not interfere with the Russian thinking or the Soviet thinking, and by that way they managed to sort of maintain a semi-sovereign, although a neutral sort of status. Just in closing, the last part is that a lot of the people we spoke to said, this war is going on in Ukraine, but the Ukrainians are fighting our war. And I think that was the one point that I brought home with me, was that all of these countries are watching it very closely, but they are also very aware that the tremendous sacrifice being made in Ukraine is being made on their behalf. And I think that has a lot to do with why they joined NATO as well.
And Joel, I know this has been one of your passion projects. You're very enthusiastic about this film. Why did you feel it was so important to make now? And what's different about this? How is it unique compared to how many other people are covering the war in Ukraine?
About 6 months ago, I came to the Atlantic Council with a pretty harebrained idea, and that was, can we figure out what the eastern neighbors of NATO, the two newest members, Finland and Sweden, and also Estonia, which has the most eastern border of NATO countries with Russia, how do they feel about the war in Ukraine? How do they feel about the idea that Ukraine could actually fall? And if it does, what would be the consequences? And not just the consequences to them as their small region, but the consequences to every autocrat in the world who could look at that fall and say, wait a second, I'm Xi, what's going to stop me from taking Taiwan or moving further towards the Philippines? And other autocrats around the world, would this be a message to them? So I said, like, I came here, I said, here's my idea. I called it, if Ukraine falls, what do we do? Ambassador Herbst was very willing to sit down with me and accept, let's talk about this. And then we sort of worked on the idea of who we're going to talk to, how we're going to do this trip. And I think we did this in all of about 10 days of shooting. We were able to do 3 countries and get, I think, a pretty good feel for how this area of the world feels, and also what the hybrid war is that's taking place now that Russia is definitely sponsoring. So that was basically the idea.
Great, thanks, Joel. And several months later, after that first meeting, here we are. So it's been great. For those of you in the audience, we will be taking some questions. Anyone in the audience in a few minutes. We have a microphone back there in the aisle, so in a few minutes I'll turn to questions. So start thinking of your questions now, and we'll call on you in a few minutes. So turning back to the hybrid warfare that you mentioned, Joel, one of the things that you mentioned in the film, you and Kevin, is that when you were on the Swedish ship in the Baltic Sea, there was a Chinese ship with a Russian crew dragging its anchor, cutting undersea data cables. How did that impact your filming? How did that impact your approach to the film?
Well, I think that we were on this Swedish corvette, which is a very small ship, traversing the Baltic Sea from a port in Sweden to Turku in Finland. It was incredibly rough seas. We all had patches on. We were unable to.
The patch.
We were unable to get on the deck during this voyage, which was billed as 6 hours. It turned out to be 10 and a half hours. And we didn't know that this ship was also tracking all the civilian maritime ships that were in this area. And this is the northern area of the Baltic, between Sweden and Finland. And this was exactly the area where the Chinese ship, the Yiping, was dragging its anchor at the very moment that we were across. Now, we didn't know this, that they actually had any vision of what was going on until days afterwards when we heard news reports of this. And we confirmed with the Swedish Navy that, yes, in fact, this was in the EEZ area, the Economic Exclusion Zone, very similar to where this Russian ship, or this ship we think is a Russian ship, also was dragging its anchor and cut cables. So yeah, it's a often occurrence. It often is not being policed very regularly. I mean, the Chinese ship left the Baltic Sea without being stopped. The Finns decided that they actually had jurisdiction, and they made a stance, which is a very big deal. So yeah, it was interesting that as we were doing this thing, all of this hybrid warfare was going on at the very same time.
That is very interesting. And Kevin, what do you think that this hybrid warfare that you saw shows about where the conflict is right now?
Well, something actually just came out today that was alluded to by Ambassador Herbst in our documentary, and that is that someone was putting explosives on DHL planes, and It came out this afternoon as I was walking over here that the United States had actually warned Vladimir Putin that they were on to this and that they had warned him not to, obviously, sorry, I sound like that guy in the documentary, what did he say? Anyway, take Narva or something like that. But the United States was actually onto it, and they did succeed in having some small explosions on some DHL planes. And when you think about it, at the end of the day, you think of the word hybrid warfare, you think it's something that's really super high tech or something like that. And obviously, when it comes to jamming or computerized warfare, sure, but you can do just as much damage by dragging your anchor across the ocean floor, taking out, although no one knows who actually did that, taking out those gas pipelines that were going to Germany. But these sorts of things are going on, and surely they're going to be coming here next, if they aren't here already.
Ambassador Herbst, I think that's a good toss to you. Have we seen things like this already in the US? What do you think we should expect?
We have certainly seen things like this. In the first 3 or 4 months of the Biden administration, we're talking now about the late winter of 2020, 2021, and the spring of 2021, there were 2 major Russian cyber attacks on the United States, which in fact created some chaos in petroleum supplies on the East Coast and in food supplies across the country. The Biden administration, to its discredit, tried to ignore it. The fact that millions of Americans were inconvenienced by this made this a perfect political issue for the Republicans, began to talk about it, and then Biden began to address it. People forget that the summit between Biden and Putin in June of 2021 was devoted to cyber. And as we've seen reports about that summit, for example, the American ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, wrote about this. We barely talked about Ukraine at that summit because of cyber. So the Russians have played games here, and when people talk about Putin's decision to invade Ukraine with a large army in 2022, they focus principally on the disastrous Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that's not an unfair comment. But no one talks about how the Biden administration refused to deal resolutely with this hybrid attack on American interest. And Putin sadly draw conclusions about American weakness from that.
Thanks. I'd love to now take some questions from the audience. If you're ready, please step up to the microphone and let us know your name and your question.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie Feldman-Pilch. I lead the digital and electronic warfare portfolio at the Wilson Center. And most of my work really focuses on making national security make sense. So my question is about words. 2 questions, and I promise they're quick. 1, can someone please define hybrid warfare as it's intended to be defined in the documentary? And the second, I'm so struck by the decision to continue to use the phrase Cold War. It doesn't feel so cold. Why do you keep calling it that?
Well, I can answer the second one. Joel is going to answer the first one. Listen, I'm a TV news guy. You know exactly why I use the word Cold War, because we all grew up with it. And while it... No, I used it for the very reasons that I state, in that I grew up with it. It is a phrase that conjures up, for me, a time that stretches from whenever Churchill said the Iron Curtain, all the way through the Cuba Missile Crisis, all the way through Brezhnev and all those stone-faced guys that I was very aware of in my youth. Yes, there was perestroika, glasnost, whatever took place over there, but I used the word Cold War in the same way I would have used Civil War or a different term. But If you're only 32, I'm very jealous of your age, and I thank you for the question. Joel is going to explain what the heck hybrid warfare means.
Well, I mean, I'm no expert in it, but the young man, the analyst in Helsinki at the actual Hybrid Warfare Institute, which is something that both NATO and the Finnish government support, and many NATO members are participating in, explained it to me in sort of this stark way, and that is there are various incidents of sabotage that have gone on, specifically in the Baltic states. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline explosion, which at first was thought to be a Russian sabotage, and then seems to be something of a Ukrainian sabotage, but nobody really has put together some real forensic evidence of these things. What Alexei Aho has told us is that the whole idea of hybrid warfare is to be obscure, secretive, an inability to really put your finger on who did it or why they did it. Dragging an anchor could be an accident. When it happens over and over again, maybe it's not. But it's very difficult to really understand who the culprit is. But as you heard the president of Finland say, we know who did it, we need to figure out why they did it. And I think that's sort of the sinister aspect of the whole thing. Is it being orchestrated specifically by the Kremlin? I think the analysts seem to say yes, but who knows? Are the Chinese involved in a very big way because there's a Chinese ship? Well, some of our analysts said yes. Obviously, the war in Ukraine could not survive without Chinese partnership. I don't know. All of these things make it sinister, make it scary, and make it difficult for nation states to figure out who's behind it all. That's my only interpretation of hybrid war.
And at the end of the day, isn't it funny how sabotage has been around since the beginning of time, and we've just found a sexier name for it. It's sabotage.
If I could just jump in for a minute. It's worth noting that Russia's hybrid aggression, or let's say non-military aggression in Ukraine, or even in Europe, although that's a fraught phrase, has become bolder and nastier. So there have been targeted assassinations, some successful and some not. Major explosions, for example, against German and other arms producers in Europe. But just one other point I want to mention regarding Nord Stream 2. I think the narrative put out there that the Ukrainians did it was driven by an extraordinarily weak government in Germany and its fellow travelers in the German media who did not want to point the finger at Russia. And we could talk about that later if others are interested. I've had German politicians tell me that.
All right, thank you all. Next question, please.
Yes, I'm Carl Sears. I'm a former NBC producer. And congratulations on this film. It's certainly timely and extremely provocative, well presented. Borders have been drawn and redrawn for millennia. This is the world we live in. And I wanted to shift the lens a little bit because, Ambassador, you spoke a lot about Biden was not resolute enough, perhaps, but we have a new president, President-elect Trump, who's pushing U.S. expansionism, even veiled threats against Greenland, Canada, the Panama Canal. And I'm wondering, Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, voted against the $95 billion package for Ukraine this past year. So we're at a tipping point, that's quite clear. But what I'm wondering is, with President-elect Trump pushing these points about our allies and really talking about the enemy within the domestic United States as another focus, is he signaling to Putin and Xi that the big fish swallow the little fish, this is the way it works, your imperial ambitions are not so bad, we're into that too, and that's the way we're heading, looking forward. that it's permissible. He's giving them permission covertly that this aggression is not going to be met with that much stiffness, because we're going to do a little bit of that ourselves.
That's a very provocative question, and a complex one, which definitely needs a serious answer. There has been some enthusiasm amongst the worst voices in Russian media reflecting Kremlin interests to statements made by President-elect Trump on Greenland and the Panama Canal, precisely along the lines that you suggest in your question. This shows that use of intimidation, or worse, by a great power to have its way. On the other hand, in his discussion of Greenland, I believe for the first time, President-elect Trump has declared Russia an adversary of the United States. And you can be sure that people in the Kremlin saw that too. So there's ambiguity here that can move in any direction. Now, you mentioned that Senator Rubio voted against, or was not in favor of, the aid package that finally went to Ukraine in April. And exploring further nuances, complexities. I remember very well the day the aid package passed. Among the loudest voices fulminating against the package were, of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Chip Roy, but also then Senator Vance. Even though the man who made possible the passage of that aid package, albeit late, was Donald Trump. Despite the fact also that at that time, Trump said something like, Ukraine's survival is important to the United States. And if you've noticed, Trump said within the last few weeks, I do not intend to abandon Ukraine. And we know that the Trump team, now I said in the film correctly, that the loudest voices in Trump world are like the timid voices in the Obama administration who've been spooked by Putin's nuclear threats. I don't think that extends to the president-elect or to the policy side team that he has put forward for NSC, State, which includes Rubio, and Pentagon, which includes Hegseth. So how all this plays out, I can't tell you for sure. I can tell you, though, that we saw in the first term, the first Trump term, statements made against NATO, which concerns me too. Yet the policy on NATO was actually not bad at all. And Trump did deserve credit for persuading our NATO allies to increase defense expenditures. And I can tell you as a diplomat from '79 to 2010, that every president I served under, at least starting with Reagan, was pushing for that result without effect. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a wild ride, but don't assume we're heading for oblivion.
Yeah, let's hope not. All right, thank you. Next question, please.
Michael Washura, I'm with The Insider. Right now, and for a couple of years, Ukraine is insufficiently armed and dramatically undermanned. And despite that, the Russian military is struggling to take Pokrovsk. Question, what are we afraid of? Is the threat to shopping malls and commercial shipping sufficient to deter NATO? Because it looks like it is.
Ambassador?
There you go.
Do you have a response to that?
Michael, I think you know I'm on record more than once as saying that, sadly, the Biden team was intimidated by Moscow's nuclear threats. We saw that recently in the Blinken interview with the Financial Times. I think it's also part of the book you're reading, the Woodward book. And you've seen some bien-pensants trying to justify that timidity. The United States had decades of successful nuclear diplomacy facing a more formidable foe than Putin's Russia, meaning the Soviet Union. And we did not say publicly that we could not take certain steps because the other guys may go nuclear. So we've seen an absence of backbone an absence of backbone in the outgoing administration, and again, in some of those loud voices in Trump world, which does not include, and again, my judgment, the president-elect and his principal policy advisors. That's been the principal reason.
And if I may just add that, as the foreign minister from Estonia said, Ukraine is fighting this war for all of us.
Absolutely. And all we need to do is arm them appropriately to get the result we want. That was true 3 years ago, it's true today.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, thank you guys. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown, and I hate to do this to you, but I'm bringing it back to hybrid warfare for a second. First, are there any indications that you guys saw while filming this that our partners in the Baltics are trying to use hybrid warfare techniques in opposition to the Russian aggression? And if so, kind of philosophically, do the ends really justify the means, in y'all's opinions, to use authoritative tactics against those same regimes?
I think it's a great question.
It's funny, the only thing, what jumped to mind immediately was that, and it's not answering your question, but it is adding a little bit more information to the conversation, and that is that while we were in Estonia, a number of Estonians of Russian descent or Russian operatives were arrested for running around and smashing car windows and doing, I mean, it sounds very sort of small scale, but if you live in a place like Estonia, I think that this, once again, just causes alarm amongst the people. As to whether or not they're doing it on the other side, I can't answer that question, but I just, spending a day with that fellow, the border guard guy that was talking about what they do for a living, the stuff that they grab either, once you cross that bridge, you know, you're in Schengen, which means that if you manage to sneak something in to Europe, you could be in the UK by the afternoon if you wanted, or anywhere. So I've given you an answer, not to the question that you asked, but I've hopefully added a little bit of detail and color to what is going on from the Russian side. Joel, do you know what the Finns and Estonians are doing aside from joining NATO, which isn't a covert opera thing, but it's in their face?
I would have no idea.
Look, I've been out of the State Department for 16 years, and so 4 or so years after I left, I lost my security clearance, so I don't have access to classified information. But I would hope they're doing some things. I would hope that we're doing some things, we, the United States and NATO, because unless we put a cost on Moscow for provocative behavior, we're going to get more provocative behavior. I know, not because I have access to classified information, that I believe not too long before our midterm elections in 2018, we conducted a cyber operation to raise eyebrows in Moscow to dissuade the Russians from interfering in our 2018 elections the way it interfered in 2016, and I believe it had the right result. Sadly, we did not do something similar in 2021 when they launched those 2 cyber operations against, again, petroleum and food supplies. Had we, maybe the Russians would not have invaded big in Ukraine.
All right, these are the last couple of questions. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Viola Ganger. I'm with Just Security at New York University Law School. Thank you very much and congratulations on the film. I was curious, first of all, for those of you involved in putting this together, whether you considered expanding this beyond the Baltic states and the Nordic states and looking at other parts of the periphery and Russian threats there. And for Ambassador Herbst, given what you said in the film and just now about the mixed signals that are coming from the incoming administration, what should we be looking for to figure out if there will be a firm, consistent trajectory at some point? What signs are you looking for in the next couple of months?
Well, I can answer the beginning part of your question. Yes, indeed, We would love to expand this. I think Moldova is certainly a place to look at. I think there are other places in Central Europe to look at.
Taiwan?
But yeah, exactly. I think that the real key here is to see what's happening in East Asia. And I think that there are so many examples of interference by the Chinese and the Russians who are fueling the Chinese, and the Chinese are paying for all this in hard currency, onto what their expansionist goals are and how Ukraine plays into that. And also how the United States and NATO play into funding Ukraine and arming Ukraine. And what their responses are to these hybrid warfare activities that are taking place. I mean, mostly they're not responding. So would this be a signal to other autocrats, specifically in East Asia, to say, let's just do it?
Regarding what to look for with the incoming administration, there are so many things to look for. One, what's going to happen in the Middle East if there's no deal on the hostages between Hamas and Israel? Is Trump going to they'll be held to pay for the power for Hamas? That's one sign of the strength of his statements. On the Russia question, we know that ending the war in Ukraine is a major priority for the administration. Trump has said, as I mentioned, he's not going to abandon Ukraine, but I think Putin believes he'll be able to sweet talk Trump into something. Will he be able to do that? The incoming administration has said that they need to use leverage to get the results they want. They want a sustainable peace, according to Kellogg. So will they, in fact, use leverage? The single best thing they could do is to put forward a new aid package to Ukraine loaded with weapons. That would tell Putin he cannot make additional gains on the ground while he decides whether or not to negotiate. And it would also put Ukraine in a stronger position for the negotiations to come. Critical if we want an endurable peace and a Ukraine that survives and not just survives. So these are things to watch for. And again, watch for how Trump phrases the dangers to the United States and the Arctic. Again, it's striking. He talked about Chinese ships, but also Russian ships as adversary ships.
And isn't it interesting how the Finnish border guard, because these things go on for millennia, the Finnish border guard points out to us that, oh yes, this is the border now, but it used to be Finland on the other side too, which of course that's what they're very concerned about.
Okay, we're very short on time, so this is going to be the last question.
Hi, I'm Ariel Cohen. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, non-resident. My question is about the audience. I started this business decades ago as an audience researcher for Radio Liberty. So who is your audience and how can you get millions of people, both here in the United States, but also in Europe, watch this movie? Because yes, we all know that the Finns, the Swedes, the Estonians, and others in Eastern Europe or in Northern Europe react the way you showed. What about the Portuguese? What about the Spaniards? What about the Italians? Can you push this film sooner rather than later to the European audiences and to American audiences that may be distracted by Los Angeles fires or by the border or by inflation or by other things? Yes, Shelby, I'm done. Thank you.
Good question.
That's a great question. Joel, who is the audience for the film?
Well, we hope it's an American audience. I mean, that to me is what our whole goal was, is to sort of, as journalists, to sort of give an American audience a perspective that they wouldn't ordinarily see. And also be able to pinpoint on a map where Estonia is, for instance, and where is Finland and where is the Baltic Sea, which I don't think very many Americans would have a really great idea of, and their proximity to Russia. So I think that's the main goal. I would think a secondary goal would be to obviously hear from others in the alliance to see if they agree or disagree with what the Finns and the Swedes and the Estonians have to say about their neighbors.
And I would hope that historically, by looking at the little bit of history that we included, if an audience in America was to watch this in some way, they would perhaps get a bit of a takeaway that, you know, these people have lived through this before. These people's, I had a talk about Estonia, and I'll make a short aside. I had a high school teacher who was from Estonia. It was my high school French teacher. By the time we left at the end of that year, we knew more about Estonia and more about what the Soviets did to the Baltic states and more about what happened to her grandparents and these sorts of things than I ever would have learned in any history class. We included those bits about the Winter War and what happened to the Baltic states in there because I think that it is telling to anyone who watches it that these things do go on and they will continue to go on unless someone stops it. And as the ambassador has said several times, it appears that we're the ones that can stop it. And it's up to us. And hopefully that's the message that we're going to share with whatever audience does watch it. If you can get me a screening in Portugal, give me a call.
I would love to hear from Tom Costello, who's been standing there for a while. I'll just introduce, Tom is an active NBC News correspondent, and he and I did a documentary last year with the Norwegians looking at the gas pipelines and all the other vulnerable things, so please.
But I'm just curious, Kevin and Joel, having been to Estonia and in that region, I was just over the weekend listening to a Ministry of Defense expert from the UK talking about the estimates that the Russians are losing 30 to 40,000 men a month, that their total now is 750,000 people dead or wounded on the Russian side, and that they're pulling tanks out from vintage World War II and 1950s Hungarian invasion stuff. It makes me wonder, and I have a Belgian mother-in-law who's terrified of another Russian World War, Russian-induced World War. It makes me wonder whether, in fact, they are so depleted, they have been so decimated by this war in Ukraine that the risk to the Baltics, while significant, may actually be less today than it was 5 years ago because they don't have the resources, they don't have the manpower, there's general fear about another mobilization that will be very unpopular. I'm just wondering what you picked up on the border there. Do they think maybe this has actually bought them some time to prepare?
Yes, I think that's right. And the other part of it, Tom, is that, as the one fellow said, the one security expert, that we have to stop falling for Putin's bluffs, and that, as he also mentioned, that he says Russia has no reserves. Their economy is being slammed by this, and as the ambassador says, it is time to start calling his bluff.
It's one more situation where you have to look at not just the military, but the political side. I believe that the damage done to the Russian military is substantial as reported. So in fact, the Russian conventional arms are notably weaker today than they were before the big invasion. It's also true, since Putin does not seem to have a high regard for Russian lives, that were they to win this war, and the only way they win this war is if the West goes derelict, which starts here in Washington, if it goes in that direction, which I'm not saying it will, it would not be hard after conquest of Ukraine for Moscow to take 3 or 5 years, reconstitute its forces, pull in more conscripts, although they may not be called conscripts, maybe bring in some more North Koreans, and be ready for something new against a West which has demonstrated additional fecklessness. Fecklessness which will only encourage Xi to move on Taiwan and create multiple crises. This is such a no-brainer, but it only works if the political leadership understands it and makes it a priority to explain it to their public. If they don't, we're in the soup, and I don't want to be in the soup.
Is it borscht?
All right, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Tom, for that question. Ambassador John Herbst, Kevin Tibbles, Joel Seidman, thank you so much.